In this video, I'm going to show you how I made these adjustable extension wings for my radial arm saw station, which can actually be applied to any workbench to increase the surface area of your table, or to provide a jungle gym for the kids. But like I said, these just aren't useful for my radial arm saw station. These can be added to just about any workbench or table, including the outfeed table for your table saw, to help with long crosscuts. Now, if you're interested in adding one of these to your workbench or outfeed table, check the description of this video for a link to the plans, which will give you the complete list of parts and step-by-step directions, absolutely free to download. I've been using this radial arm saw station for, I think it's just under 3 years now. And if you've watched any of my videos, you know that I use it for both cross-cutting and for ripping. I no longer have a table saw, so I do all of my ripping on here and all of my cross-cutting on here, which is great for most situations. However, if I have a big 4x8 sheet of plywood, I still usually break it down first with a circular saw before I take it here to rip smaller pieces. And that's primarily because there's not enough table support to support a large 4x8 sheet of plywood. Now, I did design this radial arm saw station so that this fence moves to the back, this fence also moves to the back, this drop leaf comes up, just to give you even more table support for ripping larger sheets of plywood. However, in the case of a full 4x8 sheet of plywood, it's still too much out this way, hanging off the table, so you need to put some support under here. So typically what I do is I'm sure all of you are familiar with these. I'll put these on the ground. However, these are really wobbly, they're cumbersome to deal with. I usually have to put some boards underneath to lift them up to match the surface of the table. And I'm always tripping over these things and I'm knocking them over. And so this is one area that I've always felt could be improved. But this morning, I had this idea. I was thinking, how awesome would it be if I had something like this that I could just pull out when I wanted more table support, with another one over here, or when I'm done ripping, I could just push it back into the table and reclaim all of my floor space. Wouldn't that be sweet? Now, in order for this to work well, we need to make sure that the 2x4 rail that we're using is perfectly straight on the top edge. So first, I use my joiner to square things up. After I got everything squared up, I used my Inker T-rule to carefully lay out the location where I wanted the holes for the cast iron pipe. I decided to use black cast iron pipe because it's relatively inexpensive, it's very strong, and it's resistant to flexing, at least for this application. Now, I didn't drill all the way through the rail. I left about an 1/8 inch on the bottom so that the threaded pipe wouldn't show through. After drilling out the holes, I laid out the locations of the ball bearings with equal spacing. Now, the trickiest part in all of this is to make sure that you drill the table apron holes in the correct locations and that you drill them the correct size so that the pipe rides on the bottom edge of the apron hole and has just enough of a gap above the pipe to allow for fine adjustments. Now, don't just drill your holes anywhere. Be sure to drill them in the precise location that ensures that your pipe will be parallel with the surface of the table throughout the full motion of the extension wing. I know it sounds a little confusing, but I dedicated an entire section in the plans for this. So if you don't have the plans, make sure you go download those plans. And again, those are free, so there's no charge. One of the reasons why this is a little tricky is because every tabletop has a different plywood thickness. Some are 3/4 of an inch, some are 1/2 inch, some are supposed to be 3/4 but aren't really 3/4. But it's not a problem because we can clamp the rail to the table and then use a straight edge to make the ball bearings flush with the surface of the table, and then measure precisely to a predetermined mark on the rail to find the location of the apron holes. After we have our measurements, we can transfer the marks onto the apron and then drill the holes. Inker makes this precision T-roll that you see me using here, which has these tiny little holes and slots that are designed for a 0.5mm pencil, and it allows for accuracy up to 1/64 of an inch, which makes this type of work a piece of cake. After getting the apron holes drilled, I used a hacksaw to cut the pipe to length, but it was a little slow going, so I switched to my Sawzall, which was much faster. After cutting the pipe, there were some sharp burrs on the end, so I took it over to the grinder to smooth out the edges. Then I headed over to the drill press and drilled a hole in the end to fit a furniture glide. So the idea here is that I'll have the threaded stem of a furniture glide inserted into the hole, and a nylon lock nut will allow for up and down adjustment so that I can fine-tune the pipe to make it perfectly parallel with the surface of the table. Then we'll use a hose clamp to create a stop so that the extension wing can only be pulled out so far. If you're not familiar with furniture glides, they basically thread into the bottom of heavy furniture and table legs, and they make it really easy to slide across carpet, vinyl flooring, etc. The ones I'm using have a 1.5 inch long stem, and I'll have a link to these in the description of the video. The cast iron pipe that I'm using has tapered threads on the end, so it's relatively easy to get the threads started and turned by hand. But because of the tapered threads, it gets more difficult the farther in it goes, so a pipe wrench does the trick to thread them in all the way. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of up and down play, even though the apron holes are only slightly larger than the pipe. But after we install the furniture glides, we can dial it in so that the ball bearings are perfectly flush with the top of the table and parallel with the table so that we can choose how far to pull out the extension wing from project to project. But before we add the furniture glides, we need to slide on these small hose clamps, which will allow us to set our stops later. Since there's not a whole lot of clearance to slip the furniture glide into the hole from the top, I slipped it in from the side and then used a pipe wrench to rotate it back in place. After the glide was installed, I pulled out the extension wing to the max position needed to support a full 5x5 sheet of plywood. Then I secured the stops in place. Next, I used the other extension wing as a straight edge to help set the roller bearings to be level with the surface of the table.
Are we there yet? And how much longer?
After getting the bearings perfectly flush with the table, it was a little difficult to pull out the extension wing, so I applied a liberal amount of paste wax to lubricate the pipe, and this helped a ton.
Way better.
After finishing up the left extension wing, I went through the exact same process to build out the right wing. Then it was time to put it to the test. To check things out, I used a 5x5 sheet of Baltic birch plywood and everything looked perfect. The sheet stayed perfectly flat on the table, allowing me to push it through the virtual cut effortlessly. I didn't want to waste a perfectly good sheet of Baltic birch, so if you want to see me rip through mountains of plywood, you'll have to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and wait to see what I have in store. But for now, I'll leave you with this.